The odds of waking within 60 seconds of your alarm by chance are roughly 1 in 500. You do it several times a week. Some mornings you open your eyes 30 seconds before the sound, lie in the dark feeling oddly alert, and silence the alarm before it completes its first chime. You have done this so many times that you stop being surprised by it, but you have never been given an explanation for how a sleeping brain, unconscious and disconnected from the environment, tracks time with the precision of a stopwatch and delivers you to wakefulness at the exact minute you planned. The explanation involves a hormonal cascade that begins 90 minutes before your alarm fires, a cascade driven by a gland at the base of your brain that has learned what time you expect to wake and begins preparing your body for that moment while you are still dreaming. The alarm does not wake you. The alarm confirms a process that has been running for an hour and a half. The phenomenon is real and it has been measured. Surveys of habitual alarm users report that 50 to 70% of respondents have repeatedly experienced waking immediately before their alarm. The frequency rules out coincidence. 60 seconds out of a 28,800 second sleep period gives a random probability of roughly 0.2% per night. A random wake time would land within 60 seconds of the alarm roughly once a month across habitual use. Most people who keep a consistent schedule report it happening several times per week, sometimes daily. Consistency is the clue. Pre-alarm waking is most reliable in people who wake at a consistent time every day. It is less consistent with irregular schedules. It disappears almost entirely during jet lag or shift work disruption. The pattern is diagnostic. The mechanism is circadian, not random. Something inside the brain is using a learned expectation of wake time to generate the awakening. When the expectation is stable, the mechanism delivers. When the expectation is disrupted, the mechanism fails. Simple explanations do not survive scrutiny. You are not half awake and coincidentally aware when the alarm approaches. Sleep recordings show that most pre-alarm awakenings occur from a solid sleep state, not from fragmented wakefulness. You are not hearing environmental cues that correlate with morning pre-alarm awakening, occurs in soundproof sleep laboratories with no ambient input, in unfamiliar environments where the usual sounds are absent. You are not glancing at a clock and falling back asleep. The phenomenon occurs in total darkness with no visible time display. The mechanism is internal, and it is precisely timed to a specific expected wake time that exists only as a memory inside the sleeping brain. Brain keeps time during sleep. The circadian clock, the 20,000 neuron timekeeper, the sleep timing discussion described, fires rhythmically throughout the night, maintaining its 24-hour program regardless of whether you are awake or asleep. The clock does not switch off when consciousness does. It continues sending timing signals to every downstream system on schedule. But the circadian clock alone does not produce pre-alarm waking. The clock runs on its endogenous rhythm, synchronized to external time through light exposure. Pre-alarm waking is synchronized to the alarm time, which may differ from the clock's natural wake phase by hours. Someone who sets an alarm for 5 in the morning when their natural wake would be 7 still experiences pre-alarm awakening. The circadian clock did not produce the 5 o'clock wake. Something else did. A second timing mechanism, one that learns the expected wake time and adjusts the wake cascade to match, was identified in a landmark study published in Nature in 1999. A sleep study at the University of Lübeck, published in Nature in 1999 by Bourne and colleagues, used a single experimental manipulation. On alternate nights, subjects were told one of two things. Either they would be woken at 6 in the morning or they would be woken at 9. The actual wake time was identical for both conditions. The expectations differed, not the outcomes. Blood samples were drawn throughout the night through an intravenous line. Finding changed the field. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, released by the pituitary gland at the base of the brain, began rising approximately 60 minutes before the expected wake time, not the actual wake time. Subjects told they would be woken at 6 showed hormone elevation beginning at 5. Subjects told they would be woken at 9 showed elevation beginning at 8. The external conditions were identical. Same room, same bed, same temperature, same absence of light. The only variable was what the subject expected. The expectation drove the cascade. Sleeping brain tracked the expected wake time, stored overnight as a memory, and used that memory to time a hormonal preparation that began while the subject was still unconscious and unaware of the preparation occurring. Now, what that cascade actually does to your body across 90 minutes, because the cascade is a sequence, not a single event of physiological transitions, each building on the last, each shifting the body from deep sleep toward the waking state in a progression so gradual that you are conscious of only the final 30 seconds. At approximately 90 minutes before expected wake, the pituitary begins releasing ACTH. The hormone travels through the bloodstream to the adrenal glands sitting on top of your kidneys. The adrenals respond by releasing cortisol, the hormone that mobilizes energy, sharpens alertness, and prepares the body for physical and cognitive demand. By 60 minutes before wake, cortisol levels are climbing measurably. Blood glucose begins rising as cortisol mobilizes stored glycogen from the liver. Core body temperature, which has been near its nightly minimum for hours, begins a slow increase toward waking levels. The temperature rise is the thermal gate the sleep timing discussion described, operating in reverse cooling initiated sleep. Warming is now initiating wake. Around 45 minutes, the sympathetic nervous system begins increasing its tone. Heart rate shifts. Blood pressure begins its morning rise. The body is transitioning from parasympathetic dominance, the rest and repair state that sleep requires, toward the sympathetic readiness that waking demands. The transition is gradual enough that it does not disrupt the sleep in progress. You remain asleep while your cardiovascular system is quietly preparing for the day. By 30 minutes, sleep architecture changes. The deep sleep stages have largely passed. The circadian system has already shifted the balance toward lighter sleep and dreaming stages in the second half of the night. Brief arousals become more frequent but remain below conscious awareness. The brain is preparing for wake without executing it. The arousal threshold, the intensity of stimulus required to produce waking, has dropped dramatically compared to 2 hours earlier. By 15 minutes, cortisol is at or near its morning peak. The body is hormonally primed. Any minor disturbance, a change in breathing pattern, a subtle shift in room light, even the attention fluctuations produced by dreaming, can trigger the final transition to consciousness. And then, 0 to 5 minutes before the alarm the threshold crosses, you wake. The transition feels instantaneous, but the preparation has been running for 90 minutes. You are not waking because you heard the alarm coming. You are waking because a hormonal cascade that began while you were dreaming has progressively lowered your arousal threshold to the point where consciousness returns on its own or returns at the slightest trigger, which the alarm provides. Alarm does not wake you because it is loud. The alarm wakes you because you have been hormonally preparing for 90 minutes, and the sound crosses a threshold that has been lowering since before you last dreamed. That cascade, 90 minutes of hormonal preparation timed to an expectation the sleeping brain retained from the previous evening, cortisol rising on schedule, temperature climbing, sympathetic tone shifting, sleep architecture lightening, arousal threshold dropping until consciousness returns before the sound arrives, is the sequence that disqualified the word alarm for me. The alarm is the last confirmation, not the cause, of a process that started without it. Mechanism connecting expected wake time to the hormonal release has not been fully mapped, and the uncertainty reveals something about how much of the brain's sleep time processing remains unknown. Leading theory involves a signal from your prefrontal cortex to the region that controls the pituitary. The prefrontal cortex does not shut off completely during sleep. It reduces activity but maintains function, particularly during dreaming phases. Memory of the expected wake time is consolidated during sleep. Timing information is relayed to the regions that control hormonal release. Alternative theory. The circadian clock receives input about recent wake times and averages them to predict the next. If you have consistently woken at 6 for weeks, the clock expects 6 regardless of tonight's alarm setting. This explains why the mechanism works best with consistent schedules and fails with irregular ones. The averaging requires stable data. Most likely, both operate together: a short-term prefrontal signal carrying tomorrow's specific expectation, combined with a long-term circadian pattern carrying the average of recent weeks, converging on the pituitary to trigger the cascade at the appropriate time. The convergence of two timing inputs, one cognitive, one circadian, produces more reliable timing than either alone. This dual input model explains several observations that neither theory handles independently. It explains why you still wake before a new alarm time. On the first morning, the prefrontal expectation overrides the circadian average. It explains why the mechanism becomes more reliable over days and weeks. At a consistent time, the circadian average converges with the prefrontal expectation. And it explains why the mechanism survives nights when you forget to set the alarm entirely. The circadian average fires the cascade even without tonight's explicit expectation, which is why you sometimes wake at your usual time on a Saturday morning when no alarm was set and you intended to sleep in. Saturday wake is the mechanism operating without permission. The circadian average does not know it is the weekend. It has been trained on 5 consecutive identical wake times. It fires the cascade. You wake at 6:30 on Saturday morning, annoyed, unable to fall back asleep because the cortisol is already in your blood and the glucose is already mobilized. The annoyance is real. The inability to override the cascade is physiological. The cortisol does not care about your weekend plans. By Sunday, if you manage to sleep later on Saturday, the circadian average has shifted by approximately 1 hour, not enough to prevent the early wake, but enough to delay it slightly. Monday morning resets the training. Sleeping next to someone who wakes at a different time introduces a variable the mechanism must navigate, and the navigation reveals how sensitive the arousal threshold becomes in the final phase of the cascade. If your partner's alarm fires at 5:30 and yours is set for 6:30, the 60-minute gap should be safe. Your cascade has not yet lowered your threshold enough for their alarm to wake you. But if your cascade began at 5 because your circadian average is trained to your 6:30 wake, your threshold is already dropping when their alarm fires at 5:30. You are 40 minutes into your cascade. The threshold is lower than it was at midnight, but higher than it will be at 6:25. Whether their alarm wakes you depends on the intensity of the sound and the depth of your current sleep stage, and the calculation changes night by night depending on where in the sleep cycle the alarm catches you. Couples who wake an hour apart often find that the earlier alarm wakes the later sleeper on some mornings and not others. The inconsistency is the cascade's threshold interacting with the sleep cycle's position at the moment the sound arrives. People who never use alarms, natural wakers who have abandoned the alarm, entirely demonstrate the mechanism in its purest form. Their circadian average, reinforced over months and years of consistent timing, fires the cascade without any prefrontal expectation for a specific morning. The cascade runs on the average alone. These people wake within a 5 to 10 minute window at one consistent time every morning, including weekends, including holidays, including the mornings they desperately want to sleep in. The mechanism is not optional for them. It has been trained so thoroughly that the circadian input alone is sufficient to drive the full 90-minute cascade without any conscious intention the night before. The natural waker has not achieved superior discipline. They have trained a hormonal system to the point where it operates autonomously. The transition from alarm-dependent to natural waking typically takes 2 to 4 weeks of consistent wake times. The circadian average needs that many data points to produce a reliable cascade, and the trust required to abandon the alarm needs that many successful mornings to build. Travel across time zones produces a specific disruption that reveals how long the circadian average takes to retrain. After a 6-hour eastward flight, the circadian average is still trained to the departure time zone. The cascade fires 6 hours too late by the destination clock. You set a local alarm for 7 in the morning, but your circadian average is expecting 1 in the afternoon. No cascade fires. The alarm wakes you cold, no preparation, full sleep inertia, the jarring transition of an unplanned wake. Over the following days, the circadian average shifts approximately 1 hour per day toward the new time zone. By day 6 or 7, the average has converged on the new alarm time and the pre-alarm wake returns. The return of precision waking after jet lag is the circadian average completing its retraining, and the week of miserable alarm-driven mornings before the return is the retraining in progress. And then why the cascade failing feels so different from the cascade succeeding. Being woken by an alarm you did not plan for, a fire alarm at 3 in the morning, a phone call at 2, an unexpected noise in the dark is experienced as jarring and disorienting because the body has not been preparing. No ACTH cascade, no cortisol mobilization, no temperature rise, no sympathetic priming, no progressive lightening of sleep architecture. The wake is abrupt. The brain has not transitioned. Sleep inertia, the grogginess, the confusion, The impaired cognition that follows sudden awakening is severe because every system that should have been gradually transitioning for 90 minutes was instead interrupted mid-process. Well, the difference between a planned wake and an unplanned wake is the difference between a prepared body and a startled one. The planned wake has cortisol available. Glucose is circulating, the sympathetic system is engaged, and core temperature is rising. The brain has been lightening its sleep stages for 30 minutes. You open your eyes and the world is accessible. The unplanned wake has none of this preparation. Cortisol must be released reactively rather than proactively. Glucose is not yet mobilized. The brain was in deep sleep and must transition to waking without the gradual ramp. The result is the 20 to 30-minute fog that follows unexpected awakening, the period your body needs to execute reactively what it normally executes across 90 anticipatory minutes. If you are over 45, two age-related changes affect this mechanism, and the changes explain a common frustration. Cortisol rhythm amplitude decreases with age. The difference between the nighttime trough and the morning peak becomes smaller. The trough rises and the peak lowers. The anticipatory cascade still fires, but the cortisol surge that drives the final wake transition is less pronounced. The result, the cascade runs, sleep lightens on schedule, but the final transition to full wakefulness takes longer. The "I woke up, but I don't feel awake" experience becomes more frequent because the cortisol peak that should produce sharp morning alertness has a lower ceiling than it did at 30. Sleep architecture changes compound this. With less deep slow-wave sleep in the first half of the night, sleep is lighter overall by the second half. The pre-alarm lightening that the cascade produces is less distinct from the already lighter baseline. The brain's arousal threshold is already lower than a younger brain's threshold would be at that hour, which is why many older adults wake before the cascade has fully completed, sometimes 2 or 3 hours before the alarm rather than the precise 1 to 5 minutes the phenomenon is known for. The mechanism is still running. The threshold it is trying to reach is already closer to waking than it used to be. The cascade arrives at an already primed system and produces premature awakening rather than precision awakening. If you find yourself waking consistently at 4 or 4:30 when your alarm is set for 6:30, the mechanism is here. The cascade is firing on schedule, but the threshold is lower than the cascade was calibrated for. The result is early waking rather than pre-alarm waking. The frustration of early waking in older adults is often the anticipatory cascade working correctly against a sleep architecture that has changed. Children demonstrate the opposite pattern, and the contrast reveals the age dependence of the mechanism. Children under 10 rarely experience pre-alarm waking. Their deep sleep is profound. The arousal threshold is so high that the anticipatory cascade, which runs in children as it does in adults, cannot lower the threshold enough to produce waking before the alarm. The child sleeps through the cascade. The alarm provides the high-intensity stimulus required to cross the elevated threshold. This is why children are notoriously difficult to wake, not because the mechanism is absent, but because the threshold it must cross is higher than the cascade can reach. Adolescents experience a different disruption. The circadian clock shifts later during puberty, pushing the natural wake time to 9 or 10 in the morning. A school alarm at 6:30 forces a cascade that must fire at 5 deep in the circadian trough, when the clock is still signaling sleep. The cascade fires but competes with the circadian signal, pushing in the 2 opposite direction. The result? The adolescent wakes to the alarm feeling terrible, because the cascade ran against the clock rather than with it. The pre-alarm wake phenomenon disappears during adolescence, not because the mechanism stopped, but because the circadian opposition prevents the cascade from completing before the alarm intervenes. Anxiety about oversleeping disrupts the mechanism through a paradox. The fear of missing the alarm prevents the sleep the mechanism requires. If you are anxious about an early flight, a job interview, an important morning commitment, the prefrontal signal is stronger than usual, the wake time is emotionally loaded, the expectation carries urgency. The gland may respond by firing the cascade earlier than necessary, producing waking at 3 or 4 in the morning rather than at the intended 5:30. The premature wake is the mechanism overcompensating for the anxiety, the urgency of the prefrontal signal pulling the cascade trigger too soon. You lie in the dark, hours before needed, unable to fall back asleep, because the cortisol has already been released and the glucose is already mobilized. The mechanism worked, it worked too well. The anxiety amplified the signal, and the gland could not distinguish between wake at 5:30 and wake at 5:30 or else. Inverse also operates. On mornings with nothing planned, no alarm, no commitment, no urgency, the prefrontal signal is weak or absent. The circadian average may fire a cascade out of habit, but without the prefrontal reinforcement, the cascade is gentler, the threshold drops more slowly, and the wake is later and more gradual. The effortless Saturday sleep-in when it works is the circadian average firing weekly without prefrontal support, producing a cascade too gentle to complete before the system drifts back into another sleep cycle. Morning exercise strengthens the mechanism over time through a feedback loop the body builds between wake timing and physical demand. If you consistently exercise within the first hour of waking, the body learns to associate the wake cascade with imminent physical demand. Cortisol release becomes more robust. The anticipatory surge is larger because the body is preparing not just for waking but for the metabolic demand that has reliably followed waking for weeks or months. The pre-alarm wake becomes sharper, the transition faster, the morning alertness more immediate. The exercise is not training the wake mechanism directly, it is training the downstream systems that respond to the cascade, which feeds back to calibrate the cascade itself. Now, caffeine interferes with this mechanism in a way most people do not recognize because the interference happens the night before. Caffeine's half-life, approximately 5 to 6 hours, means that a coffee at 2 in the afternoon leaves measurable caffeine in the blood at 8 in the evening and residual levels at 2 in the morning. The caffeine occupies adenosine receptors throughout this period, including during the early hours of sleep. The adenosine masking affects sleep architecture, reducing the depth of slow-wave sleep and altering the progression through sleep stages. The altered architecture shifts the arousal threshold curve, changing the landscape the anticipatory cascade must navigate. The cascade still fires on schedule. Caffeine does not block ACTH or cortisol, but the sleep it is trying to lighten is already lighter than it should be. The threshold it is trying to lower is already lower. The result is less precise timing, either premature waking or a blurred transition where the cascade completes but the wake does not feel clean because the sleep it interrupted was already shallow. The "I woke up but I feel like I didn't sleep" morning is often afternoon. Caffeine's architectural disruption compounding the anticipatory cascade's timing. Deliberate use of the mechanism telling yourself your wake time before sleep has been documented as effective, though the magnitude of the effect varies across individuals. The Bourne experiments showed that explicit expectation drove the cascade timing. The verbal or cognitive rehearsal of a wake time before falling asleep provides the prefrontal signal that guides the hormonal preparation. Saying "I will wake at 6:30" before closing your eyes is input to the prefrontal hypothalamic pathway, not superstition that times the cascade. The input does not guarantee precision on the first night. The circadian average needs days of consistent data to converge with the prefrontal expectation. But after a week of consistent timing with consistent rehearsal, the mechanism calibrates and the pre-alarm wake becomes reliable. Setting multiple alarms undermines the mechanism, and the undermining reveals how the prefrontal expectation interacts with the cascade timing. If you set alarms at 6, 6:15, and 6:30 as insurance, the prefrontal signal is ambiguous. Which wake time should the cascade prepare for? The gland receives conflicting input. The cascade may fire early, targeting 6, and complete before you intend to wake, producing the frustrating pattern of waking at the first alarm, hitting snooze, and spending the next 30 minutes in progressively lighter sleep that provides neither rest nor alertness. The snooze cycle is a cascade that completed its work at 6, being dragged through 30 additional minutes of post-cascade sleep that the hormonal system has already transitioned away from. A single alarm at a consistent time gives the prefrontal signal one target. The cascade fires with precision because the expectation is unambiguous. The multiple alarm user is asking the mechanism to prepare for 3 different wake times simultaneously, and the mechanism is designed for one. Dream content near the wake transition carries signatures of the approaching cascade, and the signatures reveal how deeply the hormonal preparation penetrates into the sleeping mind. Dreams in the final 30 minutes before expected wake time are more likely to involve morning-related content, getting dressed, eating breakfast, commuting, arriving at work than dreams earlier in the night. The shift is not universal across every morning. but it appears frequently enough in dream journal studies to suggest that the rising cortisol and lightning sleep architecture influence the narrative content the dreaming brain produces. The dreams are not predicting the morning. The hormonal state is priming the brain's narrative generator toward wake-related themes because the chemical environment is already halfway between sleeping and waking. Some people report dreaming about their alarm going off, hearing the sound in the dream, reaching to silence it, then waking to find the real alarm about to fire or already ringing. The dream alarm is the sleeping brain's interpretation of the approaching arousal threshold. The cascade has lowered the threshold enough that the brain is generating internal simulations of the expected wake event before the event occurs. You are rehearsing the wake within the dream because the hormonal preparation has brought you close enough to consciousness that the boundary between dreaming and waking has begun to blur. That dual timing, the prefrontal memory of tomorrow's plan converging with the circadian average of recent weeks, both inputs arriving at one gland that translates expectation into a 90-minute hormonal cascade, is the coordination that dissolved the idea of a passive sleeping brain for me. Your brain keeps time during sleep. It retains the memory of when you plan to wake. It translates that memory into a hormonal cascade that begins 90 minutes before the alarm fires, cortisol rising, glucose mobilizing, temperature climbing, sympathetic tone shifting, sleep architecture lightening, arousal threshold dropping minute by minute until consciousness returns a beat ahead of the sound. The alarm is not the wake. The alarm is the last signal in a process that began while you were still dreaming and has been running patiently and precisely for an hour and a half. You have been doing this every night you have set an alarm. The mechanism has been running since the first night you expected to wake at a specific time. The alarm was never the cause, it was the confirmation, and the minute you spend lying in the dark, oddly alert, knowing the sound is about to arrive, that minute is the final second of a 90-minute preparation that your sleeping brain executed without ever telling you it had started.